Member for Kamloops Centre.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wow, I did not think that a question asking the minister why unpreferred agency got a tax break and no one else did would have struck such a nerve and question period, but apparently it did. Apparently it did. It makes one wonder what else is hidden in this budget. The minister had every opportunity to answer. They had every opportunity to answer. This is a very straightforward question, actually. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is unfortunate, as I say. I mean, it was a very straightforward question to the minister about the budget that we are talking about over the next week and a half as to decision-making for tax breaks in this budget. And the reality is, the Minister of Finance in 2018 was the Executive Director of DigiBC. It's well documented. She doesn't hide it. It's actually on the government website. People know she was there. People know she made presentations to the Finance Committee for budget input in 2018, heading into the 2019 budget. It's all factual. In fact, DigiBC actually has a press release talking about her presentation, singing her praises, and so they should. That was her job at the time. I don't begrudge any of that. But the reality is the government was not going to make, and in fact, the actual presentation was to increase BC Interactive digital media tax credit from 17.5% to 25%. This year's budget, digital tax credits go from 17.5% to 25%. This year's budget, the exact change to the tax credit happens as the then Executive Director, now Minister of Finance, pitched to the government back in 2018. Now, unfortunately, that was nowhere near an answer. I don't know what the Minister of Transportation, the House Leader, was going on about that had anything to do with that question whatsoever, but it certainly must have struck a nerve, which when you're in politics makes you wonder why. Now, as best as I can ascertain, that tax break, and based on this budget says that tax break has now been made permanent in this budget. It will be effective on September 1st this year and moving forward. And in fact, it's actually a low dollar value tax break. So I'm not quite sure. Next year, it's only $5 million for the whole year. So I'm not quite sure why we got the reaction out of government we did for something as basic as that. But I do think COFI, the Federation of Forest Industries, given that their convention is the beginning of April, given that they've said they're disappointed in lack of forestry support in this budget, and they've actually been the subject to 8 years of punitive softwood lumber tariffs, yes, tariffs, or duties, whatever you want to call it. I believe there's around $10 billion now sitting in a reserve fund out there that they've had to pay into. I think they deserve, when you look at that scale, why there's no supports in this budget that they've been lobbying for 8 years, while the government rebuffed the requests for Digital BC for the same length of time to change their tax structure to get that up to a 25% tax credit. And now the one person that lobbied the government in 2018 directly is in charge of the finances of British Columbia, and magically the first course of action in a budget that's supposed to be tightening belts and sharpening our pencils is to give that agency their wish and get a 25% tax break. Those are the simple facts. The question was asked in good faith, just to clear it up for everybody, to understand. The minister could have dealt with it very quickly. Instead, we got the diatribe from the Minister of Finance about totally irrelevant things, and we won't know. So I rest assured I will make sure to follow up on this in budget estimates if the minister doesn't want to actually give a very straightforward answer that I think not just the residents of British Columbia, but certainly the various business groups in British Columbia would be curious for. because it shines a light into how this budget was created, and it shines a light into the decision-making process of this government around these types of decisions around tax credits, especially in the backdrop of a tariff war. Because there's nothing in this budget for a tariff war, so these groups want to know. And perhaps it would be good for them to know like, who they could hire as an executive director now that might want to run for the NDP in the future and become an MLA, and who knows, maybe then their wish comes true. Is that how this government operates? Only they can answer that question. I don't know. But, Mr. Speaker, that's fundamentally the problem with this government. They hide everything in secrecy. They deflect. They try to make things seem better than they are. This whole budget is an attempt to make things seem better than they are. The only people that have given this budget any sense of passing grade is the Mutual Admiration Society that sits on the other side of this House. If you look at the coverage from the budget lockup, the groups that were there being clipped, I couldn't find one that was singing the praises of this. As close as we got was really the BCTF saying, well, at least they are meeting their contractual obligations. That's a far cry from the Premier's election promise of one teacher assistant in every classroom from K to 3. Another broken campaign promise for kids that are in need of that support. That's actually who the Premier broke the promise to. It's gut-wrenching for the parents that have a child that needs that extra support in a classroom, but it truly impacts that child directly. And not just for K to 3, that will carry on with that child through the rest of their school years if they don't get the right supports at the earlier ages. It also has a ripple effect to all the other kids, especially because they're that young, on how to navigate their own school day in a classroom where a child needs that extra support and help. It's a very real-world impact at a very small classroom level that impacts a whole neighborhood worth of kids for years to come. It makes the need for increased bullying initiatives even harder because that's what starts to spiral out of that situation as well when the right supports aren't in a classroom, with kids struggling to figure out how to deal with things on both sides. That's the implication when this Premier and when this Finance Minister shrugs and refuses to answer proper questions and legitimate questions in this House about failed campaign promises not being in this budget. And I think it's a disservice to the public that the Premier and the Finance Minister can never seem to get themselves off of that moral high ground they like to stand on whenever someone from the BC Conservatives dare ask a question, dare challenging their own promises and commitments in their own budget where they're not in. And instead of actually answering the question straight up, because it was asked straight up, we get bizarre rants and raves and total evasion of the question. It's not good enough. The Premier doesn't get to wrap himself in the Canadian and BC flag and evoke all sorts of Second World War imagery about the tariff war fight we're in, and then when faced with a legitimate, perhaps uncomfortable for him because it's about his own broken promises question, try to be evasive and play games with the question and the answer. The public rightfully deserves better. You know, as people were leaving after question period and moving around, I heard from the other side some fairly prominent ministers telling me I'm nothing but hot air. I guess it's because I like to speak for a little while in this place. I guess maybe because they felt very uncomfortable as I was pointing things out in the budget yesterday. After again, they were patting each other on the back as people were leaving a budget lockup saying the exact opposite thing about their budget. Even the unions that are waiting to get a negotiated contract with this government had pretty tepid response about this budget yesterday. The best they could say was, well, thankfully, we didn't have all our members laid off. And despite what the government wants to keep trying to say about this side of the House, we're not advocating for massive cuts in healthcare. We're not advocating and saying that those schools that desperately need teachers' assistants should have a cut in staffing. What we're saying is we actually need a government that's willing to tell us what is actually the benchmark you're shooting for. What is the deliverable you're trying to achieve as you run an $11 billion deficit? If it's healthcare, how does that relate to a better healthcare system or not? Because since 2017, healthcare used to be $18 billion, now it's $35 billion. Who says healthcare is any better now than it was in 2017? It had issues in 2017. No one disputes that at all. Nowhere near what we have now. So when the government and the ministers accuse us of having hot air or frivolous questions or non-serious, that's just deflection. That's because this government doesn't want to actually be held accountable for their failures. You know, it's interesting, the Premier at the start of his speech today rightfully pointed out how the President is saying this is such a horrible trade deal, and the irony is that it's the President that demanded this new trade deal and signed the new trade deal. I would suggest the Premier reflect on those words and look in the mirror the next time he stands in this place or his minister stands in this place and they try blaming a former government for the problems that we're faced today. Because I got news for them. They are the former government. And they were the former government before that. This is their third term. The fact we have cancer patients still needing to go to Bellingham because under their watch we went from the best cancer care in the country to the worst is 100% on them. We had issues in healthcare in 2017. Cancer care wasn't one of them. It is now. They like to go on about how we say, they're trying to say that the BC Conservatives are saying that we want to have people pay for healthcare. We've never said that. The only people that say that are the NDP about us. We do say you shouldn't need to have your Canadian passport to access cancer care. We shouldn't need to be able to make sure you have proper federal ID documentation and you and your loved one both to be able to cross the border to get down to Bellingham to go through cancer treatments because they can't get things built fast enough or properly or run properly in British Columbia. You know, the only other time in BC's history we've had to send patients to the United States into a for-profit private hospital system under contract was the last time the NDP were in government. So as much as the NDP wants to say that's the system we want, which it is not the system BC Conservatives want, that is quite literally the system this government is operating. They are contracting with U.S. private hospitals to provide cancer care. And I agree that we need to get those people that cancer care. They should not be languishing waiting. So this isn't about that. This isn't about making sure people get that access. This is about the hypocrisy when they try to fling that at us, when they're trying to defend an indefensible budget. A budget that the finance minister says is about sharpening our pencils and tightening our belts and a hiring freeze. The belt was so tight in the Ministry of Finance yesterday on budget day, the cabinet had enough time to sign 2 more cabinet orders giving promotions to 2 more people in the Ministry of Finance Communication Department on budget day. Complete with raises. Tightening our belts, sharpening our pencil. Apparently they're sharpening their pencil to sign order in councils to hire political staff. Let's look at a few of these other things that the government doesn't really like to talk about in their budget when we want to talk about prioritization of spending. Another $109 million for FIFA. I think everyone agrees FIFA is going to be a great event. Would be sure nice if the government for once would just come clean with what the total cost is going to be of FIFA instead of these constant little announcements of $100 million there and $50 million there. So now we got another $109 million in the provincial budget for FIFA. They talk in this budget about how they're accelerating housing. Well, let's take a closer look at that. When you look in the charts and the descriptions on projects already underway, over $50 million, BC Housing, 4 projects are all delayed. 4 projects that are all well over $50 million. They're all in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So significant buildings, quite a few units, all delayed. Because, you know, this government has an urgency to get people into the housing they need. That's why their housing projects are all delayed. This government says there's an urgency to get the skills trades going, training for students in universities. We need to build capacity. Well, let's see. 3 school projects and a couple of university projects delayed. Good to know they've got urgency on that file as well. And the best one of all, kind of is a twofer, it's actually student housing, and that's delayed too. So, you know, you could, I wasn't sure how to mark that down. Is it 5 housing, not 4 delayed, or 4 schooling, not 3 delayed? And then I thought, well, no, actually, it needs its own separate category because it's for our students who need proper housing as well to get a proper education at university. That's gone. This government made great fanfare, I believe it was 1 or 2 budgets ago, about how there was no longer in their effort to help green up BC, help drive down emissions, to help make EV transportation more affordable for the average British Columbian, we're removing the sales tax, PST, on used EVs. That was a couple of budgets ago. I know because I said, well, if you're going to do that, maybe we could use the exact same language, and I brought a private member's bill in a few times, and have the same tax break apply to a used car that's a gas combustion used car. And what it is if it's under a $20,000 vehicle, you don't pay PST on a used vehicle with over 6,000 kilometers. It was the exact same language the government used for the exemption for the electric vehicles. Government refused to call the bill. Government didn't want to talk about it. No, no, no. We can't do that for people trying to get by and buy a safe, reliable, cheap car to get to work or school unless they want to spend a few extra bucks and buy an EV. That was the government's mindset because it was all about greening up the economy, all about greening up BC, and therefore it was appropriate to waive the PST on a used EV. Once again, somewhat ironically, in the year that they're clinging to power with a deal with the Green Party, guess what? You now have to pay PST on a used electric vehicle. So I guess they needed that $48 million, probably to pay for the extra political staff the Premier keeps hiring. I'm not sure. But that's the problem. This is a budget, is a complex document. The minister's absolutely right about that. And it's all about trade-offs. And it's $1 million here, $1 million there, $1 million here, $1 million there. So with those last 2 hires in communications, or sorry, promotions in communications signed off on budget day, our running tally shows that that's pushing now $4.5 million of promotions and new hires signed off by the cabinet and by the finance minister, 21 of which are in the finance ministry of the 38, for promotions and new hires, $4.5 million, after they announced a hiring freeze. And the minister said very clearly, when it was brought up in question period, that political staff are exempt from the hiring freeze. They're considered core to government operations. But there's no way they could do more with less in the political offices if they didn't have a few more advisors, if they didn't have a few more communication staff, a few more strategists. Because after all, you know, how can you possibly solve the softwood lumber deal if you don't have a few more extra people working in communications? I don't think people that work in the forest industry give two hoots how many people work in the communications department in government. They want their softwood deal solved. I think when you start layering in, and we have to keep in mind, when I'm talking about communications, this is just the GCPE and the political staff communications. I'm not even talking about the health authorities, the universities, the school boards, various ministries that have internal. Like, it's massive machine. And it comes at a time, it's very interesting, and I was going back and forth with actually a reporter this morning about this, and they said, wow, you know, you start looking at those pays, that's more than any newsroom pays for a lot of these positions. And I said, yeah, and I was thinking about, you know, it was an actual text string back and forth, and I said, yeah, I was thinking about this last night too, that, you know, at a time where newsrooms aren't even sure if they're going to survive, at a time when newsrooms have less staff than they've ever had before, expected to do more work, and what do? They actually adapt. They come up with newer programs and software and tools to help them get their product out the door, right? They've adapted their workplace to make it happen. Doesn't mean it's been seamless, doesn't mean it's easy on the staff. They've had some gut-wrenching decisions where colleagues have to move on in their careers or go find something else. But it's been happening over and over and over again. The only realm in the communication sphere that seems to be growing exponentially, unchecked, to deal with those same newsrooms is government communications in BC. And again, if the government, if the Premier, if the Minister is actually sincere about addressing true non-core areas, given, you know, the light, you go to the government website, there is not that many news releases that are on that website. I get you need people that actually know how to write and have proper grammar and structure, sentence structure and all of that. I'm certainly not one of those people. I'm not even going to try to pretend otherwise. I rely on my communications person to help me with that. And before everyone at home goes, aha, he's got a communications person. You know how the opposition functions? I have a communication person that I share with 4 other MLAs. That's our staffing level. I have an assistant in Victoria that I share with 4 other MLAs. And I have a research person that I share with 5 other critics. And the research person that I share with 5 other critics, when we get to budget estimates, it'll be myself and I'm just saying me, but it'll be all of our critics will be in the same boat. Be standing in our chair just like this, talking about the budget with our respective ministries. The minister will be in their chair. The minister will have 3 or 4 staff on site so we can get proper and full answers, and that's great. The minister will have several people in a back room, depending which chamber we're in, watching, ready to come in and assist if there's a more technical question. And then depending on the ministry, you'll have a whole whack of senior management around the province watching on TV and live, texting some of those staff as well. Myself or our critics will be standing here by ourselves. And this isn't meant to be a pity party. We'll have a researcher that may or may not be occupied, because remember, they got 5 to 6 of us that they're helping at any given time, as well as other duties, to basically fact check, to know whether or not we should be pushing a little bit more on that answer, because it really was kind of an evasive answer, and God forbid the government ever be evasive with answers. They certainly were in question period today. So that's what we're up against, and we accept that. But does the government really, when they're talking about belt tightening and pencil sharpening, expect the public to think that they need that level of resources on a regular basis, essentially to push back against valid questions that critics, by way of the public, have about their ministry? Because at its core, that's all we're doing. We're simply conveying back what we're hearing in our communities. We're conveying back what we're hearing from stakeholders. We're conveying back what we have formulated in our own minds with all of those inputs overlaid. But the government seems to always take great offense to that process. They do it in question period, they do it in budget estimates. They'll get evasive in bill debate. And when we get to committee stage on a bill, it'll be much like estimates. It'll be the same thing. We'll be standing in our chair. The minister will be over there with several staff, lots of other staff watching, backfilling, providing answers. Spin. As we try to question a bill clause by clause with valid concerns about what's in that bill. So it's interesting with how bad our healthcare system is these days that the minister and the premier, they must have done some polling on this, is my only thing, and probably with some of the staff they've hired, because they like to do a lot of internal government polling as well. They spend a lot of money doing that, a lot on an election year. I tell you, you watch, that budget goes up every election year. Not that they're polling for election purposes. No, 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 that would never happen, but it just magically always seems that every fourth year the budget spikes. Anyways, healthcare is a mess. The premier, the finance minister leading up to the budget, they're going to sharpen their pencils, they're going to tighten their belts, but they're not going after core services. They're going to go after things like administration in healthcare. I think we all agree we don't have a doctor or a nurse to spare, so we can't be cutting there, obviously. So they're going to go after administration. And believe me, I 100% agree there's a lot of waste in healthcare administration, leading to other waste and leading to duplication and everything else. So there's a lot of efficiencies to be found on the administrative side, absolutely. But don't you find it strange, if you're viewing at home right now, that the government feels that needs some belt tightening and pencil sharpening, but political staff in the Premier's office and the Minister of Finance office and in all of government, political staff can just keep expanding at will and be exempt from any type of belt tightening and pencil sharpening? Doesn't that seem strange in the face of a tariff war, in the face of record deficits, despite tariffs actually not being taken into account for that budget that has record deficits? Don't you find it strange that that's the government's priority around how they're going to try to get things under control? I thought you were supposed to lead by example. I've always thought you should be showing the rest of the government operation how a government can operate effectively for the public and deliver the services within a certain fiscal envelope by actually demonstrating that you're willing to actually have a change to how you work and how that happens. Not this government. This government, as they do with everything, is willing to point the finger everywhere else. So the government spending is out of control. It's healthcare administration's fault. They seem to forget that they've been in charge of overseeing healthcare administration for the last 7 years. Spending's out of control. It's this other ministry's fault. Well, they've been in charge of that other ministry for the last 7.5 years. Political staff spending is out of control. Severances are out of control for political staff. And what do? They don't take responsibility for it. They try to blame the opposition for raising the question. They hope that the question will just disappear, that the public won't be outraged about the lack of direction setting a budget. So when the finance minister says, we're on a path to balanced budgets, and you look at this balanced budget that says $11 billion this year, $10 billion next year, $9 billion the following year as a deficit, I have a hard time believing that's a path to balanced budgets, and I'll tell you why. Because this time last year, the government was telling us that this year's deficit was going to be $7.8 billion. And by the time we got here, it was 10.9. So I don't believe the 10 billion for next year, and I certainly don't believe the 9 billion for the following year, not at the rate that they're sharpening their pencils and tightening their belts. It's all lip service. We have a situation right now with a tariff threat, and no one knows exactly where it's going to go. And frankly, BC can't control directly what the president will or won't do. I'm not sure anyone in the world can. Maybe Mr. Musk, I don't know. But I also don't know what his thought process is on all this stuff. So we will have to adapt and adjust absolutely as a province and as a country as things down in the States happen. But given that our internal trade barriers between provinces creates a 23% tariff equivalent to the BC economy, why, at a bare minimum, if the government was willing to show us modeling on what the impacts of the U.S. tariff threat is, and I congratulate and thank the minister for updating that. It's still scary numbers, better than the first model, but still needs to be taken very seriously, absolutely. Why hasn't the government modeled and shown us the positive side of getting rid of the internal trade barriers? Why won't they model to build the political will within BC, within the population, to tear down the trade barriers between provinces by saying, okay, we've modeled the bad news from the United States. Here's what would happen if we actually just trade between provinces properly. And this is the good that would be had by our BC economy. Why won't the government do that? And if they've done that, why won't they just release it? And if they haven't done it, why not? What are they negotiating? The minister says today, we're making progress on 2 items. 2 items! Like, there's a lot more than 2 items that we need to solve with trade barrier issues between our provinces. Nova Scotia signed off on it. They just said, we're done. We will accept and agree with mutual recognition of all provinces, full stop. Our leader has introduced a private member's bill that's sitting on the floor right now, modeled on Nova Scotia. We could pass that within a day or 2 in this place, and we would actually be trying to shore up BC against the tariff threat. And if the tariff threat actually doesn't materialize for any length of time, imagine that. We'd actually have an economy firing on all cylinders and doing a long way to getting rid of our record deficits. That seems to be a bad outcome from this government. They'd rather work on 1 item at a time. It simply defies logic when you look at this budget, when you look at the sheer hemorrhaging of dollars. We have a $10 billion structural operational deficit in this budget. $10 billion. There's a lot that needs to happen to get rid of that. And I know the government always tries to portray it that we're saying cut, cut, cut. We're not. We're saying be efficient, reallocate, get better outcomes, especially on the economic files, because that will spur on more growth, more dollars. Don't sit back idly and watch 7,300 agricultural workers lose their job. Actually increase supports to agriculture in a meaningful, sustained way to get it going so we can actually not be reliant on the United States for half of our produce and food. That's why when we announced that in our platform about doubling food production in BC. That's what that came from. We announced get rid of interprovincial trade barriers in our platform in the election. Before all this happened down in the States. So when the government says we don't bring anything to the table with that tirade that the transportation minister tried lobbying out there to deflect at the end of question period, it's simply not true. We've been delivering real and tangible ways to deal with the threat of tariffs, to improve the economy of BC, all while making it very clear we do not want to undermine healthcare, we do not want to undermine education services in this province. But the way we're going is simply not sustainable. If you cannot even close to balance a budget with what the government tries to say is one of the strongest economies in Canada, what exactly are they expecting to happen then to our budget if tariffs take full effect for any sustained period? This is a government that inherited surpluses, balanced budgets and surpluses. And in fact, through Carol James as finance minister, they were still balancing the budget and staying in surplus. I never thought I'd see that, but it was repeated years of an NDP cabinet minister, a finance minister, delivering balanced budgets and surpluses. That record is very clear. Boy, did the world change in BC when the current premier took office. You just have to look at the trajectory of spending in this province and the trajectory of our deficits, all under this premier's watch, and one would argue his direction. It's always been question marks about, how much autonomy the finance minister really has in budgets versus the premier's office. No one will ever really know. I'm sure they have NDAs when they're signing their checks for $350,000 severances, so we'll probably never find that out. But overall, Mr. Speaker, that's the problem with the budget. You've got, I could start diving into specific line items on a much more granular basis, but really, I've always felt the critic's role is to just kind of set that higher overview of why this is such a problematic budget. So we got business confidence collapsing in this province leading up to this budget. Every business group has been disappointed. It was funny, I got asked yesterday in the media scrum after the budget, and again, I'm in my own lockup with a few staff and a couple of MLA colleagues. We're not with the minister and the media and the stakeholders. We're on a kind of information blackout, if you will, so I don't know what they're all saying to the media, especially as I'm coming straight to here, and they can't talk to the media till the minister is standing up. So all of that was unknown to me. What I found interesting was I was asked at the media scrum immediately after my speech yesterday, and they said, what letter grade would you give this budget? Well, my first response was, I thought we got rid of letter grades in BC. The second response was, I know it's going to sound because I'm in opposition, but I'd give it a D. It's uninspiring. There's no great reach. There's no inspiration for what if, tariff impact. There's just tons of missed opportunities everywhere. Well, then I was watching a recap last night of the various newscasts, and that's where you start seeing the interviews of the people that were in the lockup in the other convention center. And it was interesting because they had a whiteboard there, and almost all of them were giving it a C-. So, I wasn't really that far off, and usually I'm supposed to be the hardest grader of the bunch. And you had business groups, you had nonprofits, you had pretty much everyone giving it a C-. That's not a very good start to a 4-year term that the government hopes to cling to. No plan for the U.S. tariffs in this budget. I covered that off yesterday. Again, you just got to go back to the second quarter update. Government was projecting 1.9% growth for this coming year. Government was already projecting an $8 billion. So here's the thing. I'll get into the weeds. I got time. Last year's budget, the government projected an $8 billion deficit for this current fiscal year and essentially $8 billion deficit for this fiscal year that we're talking about in this budget. You go to the 6-month check-in point, the September 30th document that I keep referencing, the second quarter update. Government is now up to a $9.4 billion deficit, but the growth was actually a little bit ahead of what they had projected. So despite actually better than expected growth in the economy, the deficit went from $8 to $9.5 billion. This is the scary part. It doesn't seem to matter if we actually have an economy that outperforms the budget document. The budget document will still outperform it when it comes to deficits. But in that same document, when they were downgrading the growth for this coming year at 1.9%, I say downgrading because last year's budget document forecast 2.3% growth for this coming year. So I recognize it gets a little confusing here and all that bounce around, but essentially their growth was higher, yet their deficit was higher at the 6-month check-in. At the same time, the projection for this coming year was growth was going to be slower than what they were first projecting. I was telling anyone that would listen even then, there's no way it's going to be an $8 billion deficit. It's got to be at least 10 because their growth projections are lower. Then you get to this budget document, it's $11 billion, and their growth projection is 0.1% lower than what they said it would be in September. All of that happened long before the tariffs. This actually should not be a surprise to the government. It certainly shouldn't have been a surprise to the Premier when he was making election promises, when he was telling people they'd all have teachers' assistants for all their kids, when he was telling seniors that they'd have free bus passes. It's interesting, they were taking cheap shots the other day about bus passes in this place that no one even remembers, which wasn't really even a clawback of bus passes, but it's how the NDP wanted to convey it to the public, and they did good marketing. That was in opposition. They were actually better communicators when they had fewer staff. I would just give them that tidbit of advice. Yeah. But in this case, they actually promised seniors of British Columbia, who actually disproportionately vote, I would point out, they'd get a $1,000 grocery rebate if they still had decent pension incomes. But even if they didn't have a decent pension income, the ones that really need it the most would get free transit service. That's not in this. Where's the shingles vaccine promised to the seniors? That's not in this. You know, it's astounding to me. All of those promises were made with the exact same fiscal backdrop that this budget was actually created on. Quite literally. If you go to the projections of where they were talking about for natural gas and lumber, and you look at what they were projecting February of last year and then March of this year, and how those numbers swing and sway, they always do that. All of those projections are in the realm of what they would normally have, and they were on September 30th too. So talk about a game of three-card Monty this government was playing, this Premier was playing in the election with people, in terms of follow the election promise, follow the election promise. What cup is it under? What cup is it under? Oh, sorry, I guess you get nothing. Fundamentally, I can understand why people feel disappointed and feel like they were misled by election promises. Housing starts. Again, this government's praising themselves for their housing starts and their acumen around housing. Housing starts are at about the same level as they were in 2017. Despite the fact we've added 700,000 more people to the province. No plan whatsoever in this for trade, for economic growth. In fact, our exports were down 3%. Once again, before tariffs. Higher taxes across the board. Well, sorry, not higher taxes for Digital BC. They got that tax break. Higher taxes for everyone else, though. What a stroke of luck that was for them that they got their tax break in, though. That's good news. Higher costs. We're facing a tariff threat. Apparently, and I haven't tracked this down, I just had a colleague tell me, apparently Manitoba has frozen carbon tax. Last I checked, that's an NDP government, unless there's been a Manitoba election in the last little while. Huh, go figure. And you know, I talked about Carol James a few minutes ago. The other interesting part about Carol James was I'm old enough to remember when she brought in the COVID budget. And you know what this government did as a way to help people with costs and basically admitting that carbon tax was a cost to households? They froze the carbon tax for 1 year during COVID. They froze the carbon tax increase during COVID, still had a much lower deficit than we have. We're still providing, some would argue, were you not providing health services during COVID? Because I think they were. They still managed to do that without an $11 billion deficit. So the government, once before, has acknowledged that in times of financial crisis, a hike to the carbon tax might not be the best idea. And the funny thing is, that was a $5 hike. That's when they were going from $30 to $50 because of the deal they cut with the Greens the first time. That's what then Minister Heyman assured me, as the environment critic, that they would never, ever, ever go to a $100 carbon tax. Never. Will never happen. Well, April 1st, it goes up another $15. 3 times the hike in the carbon tax that Carol James froze during COVID, recognizing that it would be an increased cost to people. And people can Google it. I can remember her having a press conference and talking about the measures they were going to do in that COVID budget to try to keep people a little bit more money in their pockets. $5, which is 1.1 cents a litre. And she saw that as significant enough to freeze it. April 1st, this government is adding an extra 3.3 cents to every litre of gas. People should check their Fortis bills.
Yeah.
Home heating right now, higher than ever before, all because of the carbon tax they're currently paying, not because of the cost of gas. They're paying much more in carbon tax than they actually pay for the gas on the bill. This government won't even stand up to the federal government and say we're removing it on home heating, like the special deal that was cut by the federal government for Atlantic Canada on home heating oil, which is, I will point out, a much more polluting oil to heat your home with than natural gas. But the reality of actually doing tangible things to help people in their daily budgets so they can manage their own budget versus hope that the government may follow through on a campaign promise and maybe distribute a check to you sometime in the future, that's lost on this government because they'd much rather just control your household money and slowly dole it back to you when they think it's appropriate. Government's making a big deal about the $110 for ICBC. I agree, it's great. People are getting money back for ICBC. It's too bad they charged us too much for the first year, or the second draw, or the third draw, or now this 5th time. How about they just structurally fix the finances of ICBC and let us keep more of our money on the front end? I'd love to know if there was a briefing memo heading into this budget that said if you're looking for a big shiny announcement in the budget, give them $110 of ICBC. Because last time it was, if you want a big shiny announcement, give them $100 in BC Hydro. Give them $8 a month off of their hydro bill and they'll love you forever. Nice, big, shiny announcement. Government downplayed it. Oh, that's ridiculous. That was just some notes that were accidentally left off to the side. And then lo and behold, the budget came out and there was a $100 credit for BC Hydro. BC Hydro, this government still won't tell us what the final cost is, even though the turbines are starting to turn. It's still booked at $16 billion, if anyone believes that. I find that hard to believe. But remember, Site C at $16 billion, Site C when it first was announced was going to be $6 billion. The NDP said it would be the ruin of our rate structures. People would never be able to afford BC Hydro again with Site C at a $6 billion build. Site C is now on the books at $16 billion under this government's management, and they won't tell us what it's going to do to the rate structure. $16 billion does have to come from somewhere. And last I checked, we're the only people that pay into BC Hydro. So, you know, it's interesting because then Minister Michelle Mungal, as the Environment Minister, in July, shortly after this government took office in 2017, made it very clear during budget estimates. Site C, as of June 30th, 2017, was on time and on budget. When the keys to government were handed over to the NDP, Site C was on time, on budget, at $6 billion, and it was going to be the ruin of our BC Hydro rates, according to the NDP, at $6 billion. Here we are, over a year late, getting it online, $16 billion and climbing, and the government doesn't have the decency to tell you what it's going to do to your hydro rates or what the full cost of BC Hydro is in this budget book. Talk about lack of transparency. But they'll stand up and bluster about somebody else's, that's not even a member of our caucus, social media pages to try to deflect away from their lack of performance. The housing and the corporate income tax. Corporate income tax has dropped by 25% in BC in this budget. If that doesn't spell headwinds, I'm not sure. And I understand the calculation of it. I fully understand it's partly a recalibration of a reconciliation with the federal government of filings and appeals and things of that nature. But the outlook's not any better for the next year and the year after. It's not at 25% yet, but it's definitely not in a positive category whatsoever. The overdose crisis. 6 people a day die in this province. 6 people. You do a word search in the budget, despite the fact 6 people are dying. There's nothing in there. There's like, the word opioid doesn't show up in the budget. Fentanyl does not show up in the budget. Involuntary care does not show up in the budget. The program the minister was alluding to at $500 million, my colleague was right. The only thing she had a slight error on, and I totally understand that because I do it from time to time too with page numbers, is you're trying to, because again, we're a lean, well, I'm not so lean, but the team is a lean team of people trying to do our best for the residents of British Columbia. It was page 9, not page 7. So she was pretty darn close. You just flip one page and it's right there. She was in the right category because page 7 starts the overdose response. $500 million for continuing and sustaining. Not $500 million for more. Not $500 million for expanded. $500 million for sustaining. And you know why they need $500 million for sustaining? Because they can't keep anything to budget. What they need is $500 million more to try to provide the same services they're currently providing, which they acknowledge are not good enough. And that, I think, summarizes this budget best of all, sadly. Because this budget is rife with, we've put money here, we've put money there, put money there, for this program, that program, the other program. They've put more money in all these programs with no extra capacity being created. That's why it's not sustainable, because they won't tell us what an actual benchmark is to measure, because God forbid we actually hold the government to account and say you're not meeting your targets. I'm not sure of any entity out there that would be spending $90 billion and not have some form of a benchmark they're shooting for. What exactly is it? Now, I get you're not looking for return on investment in the traditional sense of a corporation. I've always said governments aren't business. Governments should not be run like a business, but governments should be run business-like. They should actually have targets. They should have deliverables. They should hold people accountable in the ministries. Frontline staff, management, everybody should be held accountable, but everyone needs to know, in fairness to them, what's the target they're actually striving for. No one knows. Even yesterday when the minister was talking about the plan to get the balanced budget, well, I can't really talk about the work we're undertaking as we're taking the work to try to get to the work, but we'll know when we get the work done and then we'll tell you about the work. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, and embellishing a little, but that was essentially the gist of it. That's not an answer. When we hear sharpen our pencils and belt tightening, and the best they come up with was possibly $300 million on a $90 billion budget, doesn't really sound like a lot of belt tightening, considering spending is up $3 billion this year. Only the NDP would say they're sharpening their pencils and increase spending. If you're going to find true and real and meaningful systemic efficiencies and change, efficiencies doesn't mean cuts to service. $300 million on a $90 million budget is not getting you there. An $11 billion deficit does not drive the change that you need to have in your system. When the minister stands up and says there will be no hiring this year, yet we have 73,000 more employees going to be paid for by the taxpayers of British Columbia in this budget, that is the minister reading directly from one line item and choosing to ignore a completely different line item that the taxpayers still pay for. Those 73,000 people, rightfully so, are not going to work for free. They need to be paid. What's scary is, you would think a government with this big of a political spin doctor office would have already broken down and known opposition would hone in on that, because that number was 320,000 when they first took office. It's now 593, and almost doubling. Has healthcare gotten better with that number? Has education gotten better with that? Numeracy rates are down, reading rates are down in elementary schools, in high schools. Graduation rates are starting to falter. Overdoses are up. People feel less safe on their streets than ever before. Catch and release is like we've never seen before. Correctional facilities that used to be full are running at 40%. Business confidence is at an all-time low. Debt to GDP is up. Debt is up. Deficit is up. Spending is up. Results are horrible. Housing costs are up. Housing projects are delayed. I have a housing project in my riding. It's called Cherry Avenue Apartments. I'm good. I still got some time. Hopefully people at home are sitting by a fireplace, because this is going to be a nice chat. Cherry Avenue Apartments. That was bought, and the then Minister of Housing, it's the same Minister of Housing, paid 3 times assessed value for that property. Good deal. It was a vacant 42-room, 42-apartment building that was built probably in the 60s, had a fire a couple years earlier, had sat vacant while the landlord, I'll use that term generously, was trying to decide what he wanted to do, hadn't done any repairs. One can only assume there was some form of an insurance payout or waiting for an insurance payout. So the government comes in and insists, even though it had sat in Kamloops for a couple of years, no one wanting to buy it, that they had to snap it up. And that's why they paid 3 times assessed value. They drove up property values in that whole neighborhood when they did that. One of the last few more affordable areas of Kamloops. So they drove up all the property values around there while they did it. The minister assured me in this place twice, this is how long this project's been going on, 2 separate occasions of budget estimates, 2023 and 2024. So this was the spring of 2023 it was purchased. All due diligence had been done. And in fact, the government was paying the landlord to do the repairs that he hadn't done for the previous 2 years as part of the deal. Because that always is going to work out well, we pointed out to them, but they insisted. It was all built into the price. Due diligence was done. It's well worth the 3 times assessed value plus the premium we're paying for the repairs. Jump forward a whole year. Oh, and people were supposed to be living in it by fall of 2023. Right? So this is spring of 2023. People living in it by fall of 2023. Well, people aren't living in it by fall of 2023. BC Housing, despite the fact a different motel they had bought 4 blocks away a couple years earlier and let that building freeze up over winter to the point they had to do massive repairs, delay people living in it for a year and a half. I think one building actually had to be torn down because of the water damage. Lo and behold, BC Housing let this building freeze up too, 4 blocks away. Apparently they didn't learn the first time. Maybe they thought 4 blocks away was a different climate. I'm not sure. Even if that was the case, it was on a bit of a hill compared to the other one, you know, about 50 feet higher in the air than the other one, so they would have thought maybe the altitude would have clued them in. It would be a bit chillier there, I'm not sure. But anyways, no one's living in it, frozen pipes, way more damage inside now. Lo and behold, the landlord shockingly hadn't done any repairs that they were supposed to do. BC Housing then says, oh, it's okay, we withheld the $250,000 or $400,000, 42 units, so, you know, $10,000 a unit for fire damage repairs. That'll get a lot done. In a building that didn't have enough power to actually power air conditioners in Kamloops. You know, so that's a great humane way to have people live in very small apartments with small windows, not have proper airflow or air conditioning. All known by the people in the community, which is why this building had never been sold. But BC Housing insisted to pay 3 times assessed value to get it. I had said to the minister at the time, look, if part of the reason you overpaid was it's such a big property, why don't you just tear it down and build the new building while no one's living in there? Then you're not having to displace anyone once you repair it. And you can move, however, build 100 units, build 150 units. And then you can move people into those 150 units and tear down the next really old motel you bought that needs to be replaced without displacing people. Leapfrog. Hey, great opportunity. What do I know? No, we're going to get the repairs done. We'll have people in it. So they were supposed to be in last fall. Well, they're not. 3 times assessed value. We are now hearing reports. So that was about $12.5 million at 3 times assessed value. We're now hearing reports that the original $500,000 worth of repairs is now going to be $4.2 million. There may be people living in it this fall. 3 years after there was supposed to be. And we're not actually confident about that. The contracting company doing the work now is very reputable and top-notch. This really has nothing to do with them or the agency that's supposed to be running the housing. This has everything to do with the government's rush to overpay for things and not deliver. So that's just one example of one project where they overpaid and have underdelivered. This budget book is full of that. As I said, we had 4 BC Housing projects on here that are all delayed. Most are over budget as well. Over budget, underperform. So no wonder this government doesn't want to actually be held to any tangible, measurable matrix on anything. Want to talk emissions? You want to talk emissions in this budget? Emissions aren't dropping. We've had Clean BC for years. Emissions aren't dropping. And every time you point that out to the government, Federal government screwed up on the calculations. There's a time lag on the calculations. There was this error in the calculations. We're calculating things differently. Well, I guess if you want to keep calculating things differently, you can always get yourself to a better number. Lord, help us if you actually just stayed to a consistent way of calculating emissions for the environment. But it's all performative. I don't know that the climate actually cares about their performance. You know, they're the ones insisting, so let's drive down emissions. If we're going to do it, let's do it right. Let's actually drive them down. You know, another glaring hole in this budget, speaking of emissions, and you know, the EV tax has been removed and now added to start taxing people. The interesting thing with emissions and carbon tax is what this government doesn't want to talk about is the fact that sometime this year we're having a federal election. Might be in 3 weeks, could be in 4 months. But somewhere we're having a federal election. We have to have one by fall. Everybody has said they're getting rid of, at a minimum, the consumer carbon tax. Nothing is built in this budget to actually remove the carbon tax. Not only that, there's no mention of the possibility of removing carbon tax. What is the government's plan to remove the carbon tax? Now, the minister today made it very clear if the federal government removes it, then they've said they'll remove it. When? Does everyone have to keep paying carbon tax at that increased rate for an extra 9 months before we get to another budget next year? What's the government's plan? What's the government's plan for the $3 billion of revenue that comes in from carbon tax? Because in this budget, they're insisting that the extra money that's coming in this year, the extra $672 million, is going right back out the door to people. Are they going to remove the low-income subsidies when they remove the carbon tax? Or are they just removing the revenue and keeping the spending going? I think that's a valid question people would like to know an answer to. Surely the minister must have done some modeling on that or thinking about that. It has to happen in the next few days or months, one way or the other. And then they say something else very interesting. We're going to put it back on the polluters. Well, we currently have a pricing system for large emitters that essentially says you need to have an emission profile that we agree with. As long as you're under that emission profile, you don't pay carbon tax. And in fact, if you're way below that emission profile, you can actually sell carbon credits to others. So we have a lot in our industry right now, trade-exposed industry. We've got a lot of focus on trade lately, so trade-focused industry, trade-exposed, competing with the United States that doesn't have a carbon tax. And they, under our current rules, don't as long as they meet emission profiles. So what is the minister saying when they say they're going to put it all on polluters? Are they saying that that $3 billion that they're not currently putting on big industry suddenly goes on to big industry and they have to make up the difference? Will those in big industry that meet the emission profile still be exempt from paying carbon tax? So the $3 billion will be heaped upon an even smaller group of industry that just happen to be slightly over the threshold? And even if they are, under the current rules, you just buy carbon credits somewhere else in the world and you can get yourself under the cap and avoid paying carbon tax. To which at the time the minister said, well, why would anyone, not this minister, a different minister previously, said, why would anyone do that? I said, well, I don't know, if you could buy a $4 carbon credit to say $110 in ton in carbon, wouldn't you do that? Seems like a pretty good return to me. I'm not an accountant by trade, but that just seems like pretty easy financial planning if you're a big corporation. So no detail on that. None. They just use language that sounds good, I guess, in their caucus room, but doesn't provide any certainty to industry that doesn't even know what their future holds with tariffs. Will they be subject to a tariff as well as a punitive carbon tax while they're trying to compete in a jurisdiction that has no carbon tax? I think that's a valid question that needs to be answered for the broader business community. If you run a restaurant and you're currently paying carbon tax to run all of your equipment, are you considered a big polluter or are you considered a consumer? Doesn't seem like that hard of a question to be answered by government at this stage. We've been talking about this for months. It came up before the election even. Yet no mention of it in the budget. No acknowledgement that this creates a massive problem for government moving forward. And they'll say, well, what are you going to do? What would you do? Well, I've got news for the NDP. Because of a tight election and 22 votes, I actually don't have to do that for 4 years. You do. You asked for the keys to the Treasury. You asked for control of tax policy. You asked for the ability to deal with things in a time of crisis. The public, by way of 22 votes, said, okay, we'll give you a shot. This is on your shoulders to actually not only solve the issues, but actually provide the answers in advance so people can actually plan. We are already the least competitive jurisdiction in North America to attract investment. Not having clarity on the government's plans around carbon tax doesn't help. These are significant decisions these companies are going to be making. And, you know, we have a pulp mill in Kamloops. We have a sawmill in Kamloops, some other industry. You know, and this happens in any larger operation. If they have multiple pulp mills, multiple sawmills within their company, so it's not unique to any one company. But if you have a board, and most of these do, I'm not sure if the government actually gets how this works when you're trying to attract capital into a region, right? You're going to have one mill pitching to their board why they should get the capital that year, and then you have another mill in North Carolina, and you have a mill in Quebec, and you have a mill down in Florida, and you have one maybe over in Europe. And one by one, they go to the board of directors, and they say, we know you only have $100 million to spend on capital this year, but I need 50 of it in my plant. And the other guy says, I need 70, and the other one says, and you know what they do? They look at return on investment. They look at risk. They look at return on investment. They look at stability of the jurisdiction they're operating in. They look at stability of rules and laws and regulations. They look at all of that. And the board weighs every proposal against each other internally. So when we say you're competing with North Carolina, you are at the board table level because they know what the tax laws and the rules in North Carolina are as well. They need certainty and they need risk avoidance. Capital hates risk. But they also need competitive tax structures. Without those, you're never going to get them. They will look at the workforce, obviously. But usually what I'm talking about is upgrades, and usually environmental upgrades. If you get more modern equipment into a plant. But if you're not competitive, you don't win out at that board table. And what it does is actually puts our industry in jeopardy over the long term, because the longer that keeps going on, the more antiquated that mill gets. And then the replacement becomes a full replacement. And good luck with that in this day and age. That's the backdrop that this budget has failed to address. Because there is nothing in there. As I say, the business groups have all given it a C- or worse. Small businesses said there's nothing in it for them. The public has said there's nothing in it for them. The best you can get is its status quo. I don't know how Nova Scotia was able to provide $1,000 plus to households in their most recent budget for tax breaks, but they did. I don't know how Nova Scotia was able to provide various tax breaks to small and medium-sized businesses, but they did. New Brunswick was out of the gate with tariff response immediately. You would have thought it was February 1st all over again with the Premier's response yesterday. They had over a month to come up with something new with a supposed all-star committee of cabinet members. Nothing. Nothing new, nothing in the budget. And as I pointed out yesterday, if they needed a little more time to actually have a budget reflect the tariff threat, they should have just come to this chamber and told us that. And said, you know what, we're in our legal right. They don't even have to change a law. They literally just have to give a notice to the legislature and the public that they're postponing the budget for a few weeks. Because this government had already changed the law to allow them to do that. First, it was supposed to be the 4th week in March. Then they moved it to April 30th. They've already introduced a budget once in this place that came out on April 20th, almost 3 weeks after the start of the fiscal year. They come forward, they tell us they're going to delay, they present their interim supply bill, just like they've already done. We approve the interim supply bill to keep the doors of government open and running, and we meet and talk about the budget end of March, beginning of April, and they could have put in all sorts of tariff measures. They didn't want to do that because they're relying on the federal government to provide tariff relief for British Columbians. So let's think about that for a minute. They're relying on the federal government. They don't know what the tariff relief will be coming from the federal government or not. We don't know who the Prime Minister will be in a week, not even a week, by March 9th. We don't know when a federal election will be called, sometime between now and October. We don't know, obviously, who's going to win that election, whether it'll be a majority or a minority. We don't know, as a result of that, what their final policies are going to be around tariff relief flowing back to provinces and how substantive. So the government's response to an immediate tariff threat when we're debating a budget where we could actually be doing something to have real-time help for British Columbians and businesses in British Columbia is to fob it off on the federal government, where if we're lucky, even if it's a snap election, because it's a 38-day election federally, if we're lucky, we'll have some sense of what the actual new government is going to be doing 4 to 5 months from now. That's this government taking action for tariffs. If you want to pull booze off the shelves, pull booze off the shelves. But if it's got an American flag on it and that's why you're doing it, pull it. There's all sorts of wineries from California that are actually owned by people whose headquarters are in the so-called red states. If we're in a tariff war against a country, it's a country. Last I checked, no Republicans or Democrats get to vote for anyone in this chamber. Why are we worrying about offending the sensibilities of a Democrat or a Republican? We should be worried about protecting British Columbians. Half measures, performative, hollow words, no measurables. That's all this budget is. It's interesting, in my speech yesterday, I closed out saying it's just one giant missed opportunity, and I noticed when I was pulling up quotes, there was a couple other groups that actually said the same thing. There's no way they would have heard what I was saying when they made that quote. There's no way I saw their quote when I was making my comment. It's just what was resonating as people read it. Because it truly is a bunch of missed opportunities. I don't quite know how this government, when you read through the supplement to the estimates, when you read through the estimates, when you read through the budget book, when you read through the hollow words of the speech, actually reasonably thinks the average British Columbian sees any relief for themselves in this budget, let alone in the backdrop of tariffs. This is a government that has very obviously ran out of ideas, which is scary because they're, 5 months into their term. This is a government that obviously doesn't know how to truly deliver for the British Columbia public. They don't know how to deliver for small businesses. They sure as heck don't know how to deliver cancer care without a passport. They don't know how to deliver health care in a timely fashion. I mean, we listed off, here's the response from this government. We list off a day's worth of ER closures. And within the few days after that question period, there was multiple more ER closures around this province, many at the same hospitals. No action taken. 3 years of non-stop hospital closures. And I look at that and I think, there's got to be a way. If you're sending everyone to Royal Inland Hospital, use Merritt as an example. And again, we're not supposed to be solving these problems, but I guess, since they're government and we're opposition for a little while and I want people to actually get health care when they need it, I'll give the government a suggestion. They're free to use it. How about you sit down with the nurses and you have one nurse designated every shift that says that they'll travel to Merritt if Merritt is short a nursing shift. Pay them a premium if you have to be that designated person, 24 hours a day. Kamloops Royal Inland Hospital is open 24 hours a day because the larger hospital usually can withstand one more nurse being away. Merritt can't, and as a result, they close, which puts pressure on Kamloops anyways. Couldn't you do that with one of your hospitalists as well? And have people in the larger centers getting a slight bump of pay to travel on no notice to basically go to the nearest regional hospital that's closed or going to be closing because they'll know in a few hours' time that it'll be closed because of the lack of one doctor or one nurse. It's been 3.5 years. Government hasn't done that. Hasn't even attempted it. Do it as a pilot. It's pretty easy to track. When Merritt closes, they send everyone to Royal Inland Hospital or Kelowna General. So you have 2 hospitals to choose from Merritt to backfill. If Clearwater closes, they send everyone to Kamloops. If 100 Mile House closes, and I shouldn't be saying if, when, because these all have closed. When 100 Mile House closes, they send them all to Kamloops. When Lillooet closes, they send them all to Kamloops. How about this? Instead of asking people that are sick and injured and needing emergent care to drive 2 hours and multiple people doing that, we send one nurse the other way for 2 hours and keep an ER open. Or we send one doctor the other way for 2 hours and keep the ER open. How about, instead of Kamloops doctors having to go to Kelowna to do surgeries on all their Kamloops patients for the day, and all of those patients needing to have overnight stay and family come and stay for a day or two and everything else, here's a crazy thought, since we have a whole bunch of brand new emergency or operating rooms in Kamloops, how about we have the one missing technician we need to be able to perform those surgeries in Kamloops, actually drive from Kamloops to Kelowna for the day and not inconvenience all those patients? Or when we send a full day's worth of people from Kamloops to Salmon Arm for imaging, to tie up their imaging machine for the full day so they can drive, especially this time of year, on what can be a dangerous stretch of highway, a full day worth of imaging patients. How about we send the tech to Kamloops? And we can say the same for Prince George, we can say the same for Kelowna, Cranbrook. There are ways we could minimize the impact to the public and the cost to the system if this government was willing to actually take charge. And that would actually provide efficiencies, which means a cost savings, without cuts. But all this government seems to think is as soon as you say efficiency, they think cut, cut, cut. Well, they haven't cut. They haven't cut for 8 years. And we now have an unsustainable budget, and we cannot withstand a tariff war. Yet other provinces that were in better financial shape were able to follow through on their campaign promises to people and give them tax breaks and give the businesses tax breaks and actually still be responding to tariff threats. But not this government. We've lost count. I'm hard-pressed at this point. It would be much faster if the government, one of their members, could stand up and say any substantive thing in this budget that they followed through on as a campaign promise, other than the digital tax credit. We'll let the finance minister cover that one off herself. They're simply not there. And again, to be really clear to our friends in the digital arts community, we're not saying you shouldn't have had support. We're simply asking why other agencies didn't see the same support, why other sectors of our economy who asked for similar type of help were ignored, just like you were ignored from 2018 till now, just like you were ignored when the finance minister used to do the lobbying on your behalf to ask for that tax cut until now. Just like the softwood industry has been feeling, the lumber industry has been feeling, being ignored by this government for 8 years. Remember John Horgan famously saying after the 2017 election, he was going straight to Washington, he was going to straighten out the softwood lumber deal. Went straight to Washington and came back with a check for $260,000 from some donors, and there was nothing else to that. I'm sorry, are we not supposed to talk about what happened in the past? I'm talking about the softwood lumber deal. I'm talking about the softwood lumber deal that the Minister of Finance should actually be dealing with that isn't.
Members, the member from Kamloops Centre has the floor.
Thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure how you talk about a softwood lumber deal that hasn't been solved since 2017 and talk about the actions of the NDP and the people that were making commitments on behalf of the NDP and the people of BC of what they were going to solve it. And I have nothing but respect for the late Premier Horgan, but I don't know how I talk about that issue without mentioning his name, because he was the one that said he was going to negotiate a solution to it. And instead, BC gave up their seat at the head of the softwood lumber negotiating table to the Maritimes. And we never have been back. And they've had 8 years to get back to that. So the Minister of Forests can be agitated all he likes. The people in the lumber industry, the people with closed mills, are wondering when the heck the softwood lumber deal is going to be solved by this government, as they've promised for 8 years. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, I guess I can see why the government is a little on edge these days. They announced a budget yesterday that has been met with a yawn. They were hoping to duck and weave behind tariffs, and that has been very much seen to be what it is with this budget, that it is not a tariff budget whatsoever. That is a budget that highlights the fiscal mismanagement of this government, that highlights their lack of progress on any substantive area of our everyday life, that highlights that they have no plan for the future coming years. They have no plan for carbon tax and the impacts that will have on next year's budget, and what it will mean for individuals that are receiving the low-income tax subsidy that's paid for by that carbon tax, or the businesses or the industry that relies on grants from Clean BC that's funded by carbon tax, or what they're going to do with the remainder of the carbon tax that gets dumped into general revenue. No answers for that. They've made a big deal over the years that carbon tax pays for transit. Should transit expect a cut next year because they already didn't follow through on free transit for seniors? this year. Does that mean next year with no carbon tax that transit can expect a cut? They've spent 6 years that they've been dealing with the carbon tax with Clean BC, insisting that it's paying for bike lanes in transit. What's this government's plan with that? No more bike lanes, no more transit? TransLink's got a pretty big issue. They might want to know. Lord knows their taxpayers can't afford any more on their property taxes after the debacle of the sewage plant. How's the government going to deal with it? It's great that they're extending SkyTrains. Wonderful. Everyone's in agreement with that. It's too bad they're way over budget on them because they could have got actually more built for the same amount of money. Could have actually built, I wonder how many schools along that SkyTrain line within Surrey and Langley they could have actually built with the hundreds of millions of dollars of cost overruns. And again, that's the fundamental problem with this budget. It's doing less with more money. You should be doing more with less money. You should be able to actually build a SkyTrain station and a school. When they have cost overruns on the Trans-Canada Highway outside of Kamloops, that cost overrun is the equivalent of the capital ask for the school district for the next 6 years for a scaled-back highways project. Here's a wild and crazy thought from the BC Conservatives. How about you actually build a highway on time and on budget and take that same amount of money that you're currently putting on the cost overrun and actually build schools in that same area that you're building, because we need schools everywhere. This is a government that promised no more portables in Surrey in 4 years. That was 2017. Portables have doubled. Not sure if I'm allowed to talk about that. Hopefully that's okay with the Minister of Forests that I talked about that. When they make campaign promises in Richmond and don't deliver on them, except they do, they just break the promise. When they say there won't be a housing project and then turn around right after the election and say, actually, there is going to be a housing project. And then they admonish our side for our leader letting people actually speak their minds, but they make sure that their MLA is not allowed to speak for the residents of Richmond. That's the style of government that we have delivering this budget. So, Mr. Speaker, I can see and hear that they're obviously getting agitated by their past actions or lack of action being highlighted in this budget. It's always interesting to hear the pearls of wisdom that come from the Forest Minister, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to the day that he stands up in this House and he says he has solved the softwood lumber deal and there's no more mill closures under the NDP watch, as opposed to the, 17, 18, 19? I'm losing count of how many mills have closed under their watch. Yeah. Yeah. I look forward to this government. I look forward to this government richly embracing LNG and the expansion of LNG while they're in partnership with the Green Party to try to actually get our economy growing. I look forward to that in their campaign or their budget speeches when they try to explain to us why they have no plan to balance the budget. I look forward to the Minister of Forests telling us how exactly he's going to protect the forest industry, who says there's nothing in this budget to help them, protect them, to help them through their tariff troubles, as he tries to tell them that this is all about tariffs in this budget. I look forward to the Forest Minister trying to defend that record. Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting debate in this House, Mr. Speaker, because one thing that is certain in this chamber, just like at the end of question period, when the government gets agitated, or Madam Chair, sorry, when the government gets agitated, when the government doesn't want to actually answer, they sure perk up in a hurry, and then everyone starts to try to deflect and find ways to find fault with what's being said, who's saying it, who's at fault. It's quite interesting. They've been government for 7.5 years. This is their track record. This is their track record financially. This is their track record with failures in housing, with infrastructure, with schools, with hospitals, with healthcare, with cancer care, with the opioid crisis, with public safety, with the cost of housing, with the lack of a grocery rebate that was promised, with the lack of free transit for seniors that was promised, with the lack of teachers' assistance that was promised in this last election. This is their track record that they can stand up and be accountable for. I know they're probably very proud of it. I would suggest that most of British Columbians are shaking their head in disbelief that with an $11 billion deficit, things are still getting worse in all of those sectors, not better, Mr. Speaker. Madam Chair. I don't know how much money they need to actually make themselves feel better at night, thinking they're actually making a difference in the province. But one thing is certain, there is no way the taxpayers of British Columbia can afford them. And in fact, Madam Chair, the only thing cheap about this budget is the words the government keeps talking about it. So thank you for my time.